Hello, I'm Grandmaster Alejandro Ramirez here to bring you the action of Game 11 of the World Championship match Dubai 2021 between Magnus Carlsen and Jan Nepomniachtchi. The situation with 3 points ahead for the world champion means that Jan practically really needs a victory. If he doesn't score today, he would have 2 blacks remaining where he needs 3 wins. So for all practical aspects, he absolutely is in a must-win situation. Let's see what his approach was in today's game. Let's jump in the action. Throughout the match, the challenger came with the move e4 with the white pieces, only deviating once in the previous game. But Team Nepo goes back to its preferred e4. e5, knight f3, knight c6, and perhaps because of the lack of results with the move bishop b5 going for the Ruy Lopez, Team Nepo changed up things. Played the move bishop c4 going into an Italian. Now, Nepo is not considered to be an Italian player. He plays the Spanish almost exclusively, but in some blitz games, especially in the last year, he has used the Italian more than once. Certainly familiar with it, but not his usual style. Knight f6, d3, bishop c5. Of course, there's many ways of playing the Italian opening. c3, d6 castles, and this is probably the most common setup for both sides at the moment. A quick d6, and here black has a couple of choices. I've seen people even play the move h6, they've seen the move a6. I've seen castles, even though it does allow the move bishop g5. Some people don't like allowing that. But Magnus comes up with a move that's actually relatively rare, even though it's a very common idea in the Italian nowadays. To push the pawn twice on the queen side before castling, allowing the bishop to retreat to a7, and also gaining some space on this side of the board so that white doesn't have the option of going a4, a5 themselves later in the position, which is a very often idea in this kind of structures. I like the move a5. I think that it's very rare. I saw the database and it included several hundred games with the move a5, but certainly a lot less than many of the main lines. Rook e1 was played by a little bit of thought. Bishop a7 was played quickly. Knight a3, h6, and it was the move h6 that really seemed to get Nepo out of his preparation. It's a normal move. You might be wondering why not castles directly. The reason that a lot of people don't like castling before playing the move h6, especially when this bishop is already on this side of the board, is that the move bishop g5 can be quite annoying. In many cases, after h6, bishop h4, g5, the move knight takes g5 actually works out. Pawn takes, bishop takes, and even though in this position I would be a little bit surprised that it fully works, because you do have the move king g7, and this rook would rather be on f1, not to mention that this pawn is pinned. It is possible that it does work. So not wanting to figure that out, and perhaps a more solid approach to the position, the move h6 is played. Now, I think Nepo should have gone for something a little bit more attacking. Maybe stick the knight on b5, try to make d4 early work. I don't know, something with a little bit more oomph. He plays the move knight c2. After somewhat of a significant thing, almost 15 minutes, and after the move castle bishop e3, he starts trading pieces. Now, in the Italian, there are many situations in which you trade the bishops, all the bishops, and because you get the move d4 in, you can still claim a little bit of a plus. You get the center, you get some space advantage on the queen side, but in this particular one, as we're going to see, it doesn't feel like white gets anything. Bishop takes e3, of course, there's no reason not to take this bishop. Knight takes e3, and the move rook e8. There are several ways of playing this position as well. Magnus loves the maneuver knight e7, knight g6, which I think would be perfectly playable in this position. But the move rook e8 makes a lot of sense. Bishop e6 is coming on the board, and as I mentioned, you're just removing more pieces from the action. a4 was played, grabbing a little bit of space on the queen side. Bishop e6 takes. It is possible that if you're in a must-win game, you might want some kind of imbalance. The move bishop b5 would at least keep a couple of bishops on the board, since the move knight a7 is of course not playable, as there is a pin on the rook. And I think that would be my preferred choice, especially in a game you must absolutely win. Because after taking, and queen b3, yes, the queen is harassing this pawn on b7, but the pawn is simply defended with b6. Don't really know where white's plan is in this position. Yes, you have a nice knight on e3, which can in some cases go to f5, but it seems very, very little. And I think that Team Nepo wasn't able to change the spirit of the position. What do I mean with that? It's the approach that you get. this is a very solid position for black. Even in the worst case scenario, Carlsen's only a little bit worse. He can defend very easily, he can defend all of his weaknesses, he has clear plans to develop all of his pieces, and it's not the type of position that Nepo has been able to push properly, not traditionally, and definitely not in this match. So I am a little bit surprised that they were so happy to go into an Italian in which so many bishops could be traded, because it was clear to me at this point that Magnus must be happy with his position. Rook d1 was played, preparing a future d4, even though it is very difficult to get this move in, because the pawn on e4 is always hanging. So d4 is going to be difficult to push. Knight e7 was played. I was mentioning how Magnus really loves this move, knight e7. Sometimes the knight goes to g6. In this particular position also, it holds the d5 and f5 squares away from this knight on e3. h3 was played, a little bit of a slow move, but there's not much I could recommend in this position. The move d4 obviously allows knight takes e4 after e takes d4, so I don't think it's playable. h3 then, queen d7, a very normal move. The queen here controls attacks on the pawn on e4, can sometimes suggest itself on d6, and it prepares rook d8, d5, which would be a fully equalizing maneuver. And after knight h2, trying to create some space on the king's side, very happily Magnus brought his rook to d8, knight h g4, let's take some pieces off the board, pawn takes g4, and the push d5. This has to be calculated properly, but Magnus of course had no problem doing that. Once the pawn reaches d5, it's difficult to claim any type of advantage here for white. The move knight f5 doesn't do very much. D takes e4 might be on the cards at some point. Imagine d takes e4, rook d6 type of ideas with massive simplifications, maybe not immediately, but in the near future. You can also hint at playing d4 and asking where this knight is going to be and where these rooks are pointing to. And it feels like nothing is really going right for white. d4 is probably the only try, and actually forces Magnus to come up with an important calculation. E takes d4 was played, e takes d5, and this hits the rook. Now, it's not really possible to take on d5 with the knight, because rook takes d4 creates an ugly pin, after which c4 will simply pick up the knight, or in the worst case scenario, give white a preferable position. So the correct move here is this important move, rook e4. It keeps hold over the pawn on d4, which means that you cannot take with the rook. And if you take with the pawn, or if you take with the rook, you'll get this kind of isolated type positions in which the knight simply takes happily on d5. You already have a blockade on this pawn on the d file. And if anybody's better, it's black. I'm not really sure that black is much better in this position, but it's certainly not a position that you can play for a win as white. So queen c2 is played, and again, because the rook on e4 needs to keep this defense on the pawn on d4, black has only one move, the move rook f4. And it seems like the game is pretty much headed to a draw. Everybody was expecting the move c takes d4 or even rook takes d4 with the following sequence: rook takes, pawn takes, knight takes, knight takes, queen takes, queen takes, queen takes d4, after which we have the symmetrical structure on the queen side. The asymmetry on the king side is pretty negligible. Both kings are relatively safe, both queens are quite active, and this should almost always end in a draw at the grandmaster level of play, let alone at the world championship level of play, which would give another half point to both players. Carlsen even closer to clinching the world championship match. But that's not what happened. After the move rook f4, everybody was absolutely shocked when Jan Nepomniachtchi played the move g3. This is a very strange blunder, which I've tried for the last couple of hours to brew, like how did this happen, but I still don't get it. Because it forces Magnus Carlsen to go down a specific line. There is no sidelines that you can calculate, and they're all losing for white. After d takes e3, which is the only move, we had talked about how this rook needs to keep control over the pawn on d4. So the only real idea that black has in this position is to take on e3. Sacrifice the exchange, but this can barely be called a sacrifice. This is so obviously enough compensation for black that I'm really curious on what happened here for the Russian. This is a check. The king is on the worst case scenario going to be perpetual, but on the best case scenario for black, you're just checkmating your opponent in a couple of moves. And indeed, that's actually more or less what could happen. King f1, no other move. Queen h3 check, king g1. And this is what the weird part is. Nepo could have just taken on d4 and forced that endgame into a draw. But here, on Queen g4 would just be a perpetual, but you have the spider senses that more than that is available for the black pieces, and in that, there are many ways to win. Actually, Carlsen doesn't choose the most accurate, which I was very surprised about. E takes f2 check would basically finish the game. You cannot take with the king, because queen h2 is a skewer, and if you take with the queen, this move rook d6 followed by rook g6 also ends the game. The rook enters the fray, it's a very basic rook lift. The king on g1 is simply going to get mated. These rooks are completely useless at defending the king. On a good day, you can give up the queen for the rook, but obviously a queen and a knight are so much stronger than two rooks, especially with an open king. So this was just game over. Instead, Magnus played the move knight f5, probably missing Jan's reply of d6, which keeps him in the game. There's nothing else that you can really do in this position, because knight h4 is coming and rook d6 is also coming. So you really have to play the move d6. The idea is that it doesn't allow the rook to come into the third rank. And here Magnus thought for a while and found a winning move. Now, there are many ways to win here. You could take on d6 with the pawn, or you could choose what Magnus did, which is good enough, even though it's probably not the cleanest. Knight h4 was played. This threatens checkmate on g2 as well as on f3. F takes e3 is the only way to keep the game going. And perhaps Magnus initially thought that knight f3 check won the game, but it actually surprisingly does not. After the move king f2, queen h2, king takes f3, queen takes c2, it looks like black is simply up a queen. But in reality, after the move d takes c7, there are some tactical problems. This pawn is really far advanced, and this rook is going to penetrate on d8. To give you an example, rook f8, rook d8 holding the c8 square now for the queen. Queen f5, rook e d1, surprisingly coordinates white's forces and more or less forces this pawn on c7 forward. Black could still, of course, give a perpetual, but we're not talking about giving a perpetual here for black. I mean, you're up a queen. So instead, he finds an actually winning solution after f takes e3, which is to give a check, king f1, only now play the move knight f3. Now, d takes c7 is not possible because queen g1 check is made in 2. So instead, he plays the move queen f2 to defend for a little while. But after queen h3 check, forcing again queen g2, this endgame is beyond hopeless. Black is up a pawn. It's a protected passed pawn. This rook controls the only open file, and it's about to penetrate on the second rank. And at this level of play, it is completely winning. Now, it isn't as clean as just taking on f2 and checkmating the guy, but it's good enough. This is completely winning. King f3, rook d2, rook b1, and a move g6, simply preparing the move h5. b4 was played, pawn takes b4. Now white doesn't have the luxury of taking with this pawn for several reasons, but mainly that rook a2 is simply going to pick up another pawn. So black would be up 2 pawns in a basic endgame. So Jan takes with the rook. Rook a2 is played. It's a nice move to keep corralled this rook. In case of rook c4, you have the move c5, and there is no break with the move a5. So the queen side just kind of holds itself, and the pawn is ready to roll forward. If the king keeps itself on the king side to protect from it, then this king is going to enter the game with decisive effect. King e4 was played, trying to create some kind of counterplay, but to be honest, at this point, I think the Russian had lost all hope. h5, king d5. And again, there's many ways to win this for black. Rook c2 is just one of them. Magnus calculates an endgame. Don't worry about this dubious sign. It's not dubious at all. It's just one of many ways that black can win. Rook b3, h4, king c6. And it seems like black's about to lose his queen side, and that white will get some kind of counterplay, but it's all nonsense. This pawn is too quick. And after king takes c7, h2, rook b1, which is the only way of defending against this pawn, rook takes c3 check, picks up a huge pawn. And now, if king b7, not falling for the trap that the Russian fell for, the move rook b3 still finishes the game. To not allow prompt promotion, you have to play rook h1, but here the move rook b2 would hold this pawn and will hold this pawn, and white is completely helpless against the simple plan of bringing the king, taking the rook, and winning the game. King takes b6 was played instead, but this allows a nice fork. Rook b3 check is a distraction tactic. The rook must take. There is nothing else. And h1 queen. And despite the fact that white has a pass pawn on the 5th rank with a5 and the king somewhat active, a queen is a queen, and at the World Championship level, this is a piece of cake. Queen e4 is a nice move, threatens queen e6, picking up the rook, so you don't have time to push the pawn. King a7, queen e7, check. King a8, king g7. The reason you play king g7 is that sometimes you want to give a check on the last rank, but sometimes rook b8 would pin you, so the king needs to move out of the rank. Rook b6 was played. There's no real suggestions I can make for Jan. The move a6 would simply lose the pawn to queen e6. You're double attacking the rook at the pawn. And if rook a1, queen e8 check, the king goes anywhere on the 7th. Queen e7 check would pick up the rook. So instead, rook b6 was played. And the final move of the match, queen c5, forced resignation. Either you lose this pawn on a5 or you stick this rook uncomfortably in front of it, after which I'll simply take your center/king side on e3. And black will actually push the pawns faster than white will because this pawn is not going anywhere. This was a very strange match. We had 5 games of absolutely fighting chess, especially that game 2 was thrilling for the spectators. Perhaps 3 and 4 were a little bit more dull, but game 6 was a titanic struggle. It was preparing us for one of the best matches in history, a 7-hour and 45-minute game that forced the world champion to its brink just to win the game. Everybody was exhausted following that game, finishing almost at 1 a.m. And we were very surprised with what happened forward. Note that Nepomniachtchi is not known as the most psychologically stable player on the elite, but he had a total collapse. A collapse that I have not seen at the World Championship level for a very, very long time. Trapping his bishop, blundering a pawn with the move b5, and in this one, playing the move g3 are such elementary mistakes that it's difficult to believe that they found their way to the World Championship stage. Carlsen proved not just a better player, but a more stable one, a more professional approach to the game, and he quite easily capitalized on the mistakes of his opponent. Congratulations to the winner of the 2021 World Championship match. Magnus Carlsen retains his title.